Today we celebrate the Feast of Elizabeth Ann Seton, and as I said, she's the first native-born American saint. The first American ever canonized was St. Francis Cabrini, who had come from Italy. And Elizabeth Ann Seton was, I believe, the second American that was canonized. The third was John Newman. The fourth was Kateri Tekakwitha, who was actually a Native American. But I remember when Elizabeth Ann Seton was canonized. It was for the first time that was broadcast from Rome to the United States, and it was shown on television in an afternoon, probably a Sunday afternoon. And I remember just being transfixed by the whole thing. But the thing that I remember most of all was Pope Paul VI standing there and began his homily in English by saying, "Elizabeth Ann Seton is a saint." You know, that declaration. And actually, that's what a canonization is that we declare her or him to be a saint. And that's an important thing, you know, because saints, I think there are lots of them. There are far more than the ones the church has canonized. But the ones that are canonized, in general, are canonized because they're an example to us. Elizabeth Ann Seton had a kind of checkered life. She was a young heiress and came from a well-established family in colonial New York. And, you know, she married a young and up-and-coming man named John Seton. And they had 5 kids, as I recall. And everything seemed to be going swimmingly for them until her husband got sick. And for whatever reason, the doctors in New York suggested that they go to Italy, that maybe the climate there or some of the doctors there or whatever could be of greater help to him. And so they packed up their family and they left for Italy. And because of her husband's connections in commerce, there was a family there in Italy that welcomed them and took them in to their palazzo. And they took care of John and Elizabeth Ann and the 5 kids, and they helped them through that. Unfortunately, the doctor's recommendation didn't work, and John ended up dying there in Italy. But what really touched Elizabeth Ann Seton was the compassion and kindness of this family that continued to sustain her through all of these difficult times. And even more, because they lived in a palatial house, a palazzo, they had a chapel. And Elizabeth found herself spending many, many long hours in that chapel praying. Even after the death of her husband, she continued to pray there to find the strength that she would need. And she was so moved by what she had experienced in this family's compassion and mercy that she ended up becoming a Roman Catholic. When she and her family returned to the United States, back to New York City, and her family found out that she had embraced Catholicism, they disowned her. I mean, most of us are old enough to remember when those kinds of things still happen. You know, if one of the kids got married outside the church, that was it. Done with them, you know? I can remember as an early priest hearing people talk about that. So that's what happened to her. And yet, despite the adversity, she found a way of giving of herself. She certainly took on the education of her own children and soon found that she became an educator to more than just her children. There were young Catholic girls that needed an education and there was no place for them to go. And so she gathered them to herself and decided to teach them. And soon there were other young women who came and joined her, and they ended up creating a community called the Sisters of Charity, using a model that comes from France. They founded the first American community of religious women, one that continues to this day to work among the sick and the poor and in education. You know, maybe it was because I went to first through fourth grade at a school taught by Charities, but you know, we were taught early on to pray for the canonization of Elizabeth Ann Seton. And I remember when that day Pope Paul VI said that, you know, there was a sense of satisfaction that somehow, you know, the world was recognizing the goodness of this woman. Because in the end, she's an example because of her compassion. I love that story in the gospel, except I'm not always sure I like the translation. It says Jesus was moved with pity for the crowd. And I don't think it was pity. I think he was moved by compassion. His concern for them. He saw them and their need, and he reached out to them, which is what Elizabeth Ann Seton did in her life. Because ultimately, the most important revelation that the Bible gives us comes not at the end in the book of Revelation, but rather in the letter of John that we just heard. For God is love. The very essence of God is love. And love shows itself in compassion, in a willingness to reach out to others in their need and to help them where we are able. No, today we celebrate that profound truth that God is love. And we thank God for those who have found the ability to live that love in their daily lives, to live it in a way that makes it real and tangible, in a way that touches other people's lives. So we celebrate them, these saints, some who are canonized, and I think of many others who've not been recognized by the church, but certainly have been examples of love to me. They're an inspiration to us of the compassion and the kindness of a God who is love. Today we thank God for all of them and pray that you and I can imitate their example of love and compassion so that we can follow the example of the saints and one day be one with them in the kingdom of God's glory.